Alright guys, we are replacing rear brake pads and rotors on a 2018 Ford Fusion today. And we are going to be first putting the rear parking brake into service/maintenance mode. So starting with the key on, you can do this without a scan tool, which is pretty neat. You don't need one of those fancy high dollar ones just to be able to do this. If you'll see my foot down there, if it'll focus, I'm going to take the gas pedal and put it all the way to the floor and hold it. So putting the gas pedal all the way to the floor and holding it like you see here. And then we're going to take the parking brake switch and we're going to go ahead and we're going to hold that in the release position. And we're going to cycle the key. So cycling the key, we should be able to see. So off, back on. And that puts our parking brake, as you can see that light there, into service mode. That little orange light with the little, looks like a lightning bolt in the middle. Okay, so while I embark on this job, and as you guys watch me here, I just wanted to preface a few things while we dive into this and while I prep to get this wheel off. If you're professionally doing this job, the things called out for replacement are the spring here and the caliper cradle bolts, or the pad holder bolts as well. But I'll show you how to deal with those here in a little bit. So the socket that you're going to need to remove these slider pins is a 7mm Allen key socket. You can use a 3/8 drive, that's what I used here. Okay, you'll notice me prying inside the caliper here. This is an absolute no-no on the inside pad. You absolutely never pry between the inside pad because you can tear the dust boot to the caliper piston, and that actually allows debris to get in there. The manufacturer kind of warns you against doing this way because of that. So if you don't have the special tool to compress the piston in, which is actually pretty cheap at Harbor Freight and other places, you can pry on the outside pad between the outside pad and the caliper. Point of professionalism here. Notice where that squeal tab, or wear indicator tab as some people call it, is located. Always put the new pads in matching that old tab location. You'll notice my ratchet has kind of a swivel head, or flex head, maybe they call it. That's it's a really helpful thing to have, especially when you're back here. Or if your ratchet's smaller than mine, I have this huge ratchet that I'm using. It might work better in this circumstance. So once you have the caliper bolts out, the bracket bolts, and you'll notice that Ford actually calls these bolts out for replacement, and what you see me doing here is removing the Loctite, the blue Loctite that they put on from the factory. And you might wonder, well, Mike, once you break it loose, doesn't the Loctite release? Doesn't it just kind of go away and you can just retighten the bolts? Yes, however, if you have the old Loctite on there and you don't get it off, it actually inhibits how much torque you put on that bolt, because it will start to bind as you try to run it back in. And you'll see me here in a minute run the bolts back into the caliper bracket just to make sure they go in and out smoothly so that I can get the proper torque value on them when I go to reassemble. If you're doing this job, it's also really helpful if you pick up some brake clean that I'm using here to kind of spray off and clean off the dust that I just kind of loosened up with the brush, just to get all that brake dust out of there and have a nice clean slate when you go back together. So you'll see me run the bolts in here. And if I notice any roughness at all, I run it back in, run it back out, brush it off again until it's buttery smooth. That way I know when I go to torque these things, they're 100% going to be at the right torque value, and I'm not going to have a too loose situation. Even with the Loctite that I will reapply, because Ford, that's the reason they call it out for replacement, is because it's got Loctite. They want that Loctite on there. If you buy the new bolts from Ford, you're going to pay extra money to just have Loctite pre-installed on the bolt. Unfortunately, I didn't get the shot quite right here, but what I'm doing is I'm brushing off the caliper piston side and the clamp side of the caliper so that there's no adhesive or debris remaining on the caliper. So we have another critical quality step that I want to go over here, and that is removing the rust from the hub at the contact points where the rotor actually contacts the hub. That's if you're asking yourself, well, Mike, why are you leaving a portion of rust on the hub here? The answer is the rotor doesn't contact the hub in that spot. And what I'm really concerned about is just the contact points between the rotor and hub. Once you get the hub clean like that, it minimizes the chances of run out with the new rotor. And what you'll see is I go both directions with the brass bristle brush that won't leave a score mark on the steel, but it'll also get all of that rust off. If you go both directions, you cover every, you know, patch of area. Then when you're done, you spray it off with brake clean to get all the residue off, and you're good to go. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and take these slider pins that we've now kind of removed from our caliper, and these ones are pretty clean. I didn't really need to brush the driver side, but I'm going to take a small amount of this lubricant, which you want to make sure you get the right stuff. Make sure that it is not going to swell the rubber around there, because some of these brake greases are not compatible with some of these rubbers, and you kind of want to stick with what the manufacturer recommends for, if it's a silicone paste type grease, which I think a lot of times Ford does use, and that's what I'm using here. It won't interact negatively with the rubber. If you do get the wrong grease in there, it can swell those rubber pieces to where you have to replace the rubber and re-grease the sliders, clean it all off, redo it so that it's not seizing on the rear brakes. You wouldn't think something as simple as, slider pin grease is so important, but it really is one of those minor potential disastrous things that you can mess up. So make sure you get this part right. Also be careful not to get the grease on the threads when you're actually applying it to the slider. I don't know if this is a pro tip here or just common sense, but I'm going to give it anyway. In order to just make things a little bit easier on me when I'm installing the bracket and the pads, I like to just run a lug nut and then hold the rotor in place with it while I reassemble the brake pads and the cradle. Then there's sometimes a film on the rotor from the manufacturer that they try to prevent rust. So a lot of times I just like to go in there. It's not the end of the world if you forget this step, but I like to go in there and just clean that off by spraying it down with some brake cleaner. You'll smell a funny smell if you skip that step sometimes, but it will go away after a little bit. This is me navigating through the all data information source here that I use for factory repair info. I like all data a lot for just pretty much matching all of the factory repair information that you need, and it gives you access for a relatively reasonable price. And they have more short-term options depending on how long you need the repair information for. You could buy it for a whole year, or you could buy it for like a month anymore. And it's actually really helpful. And as you can see, we have both our guide pin torque and our cradle bolt torque here. And I'm going to set the torque wrench to the proper setting. I always like to illustrate just how much difference, or how little difference in some cases, the brand new pads have from the old worn out pads. And just it illustrates just how long you can go on any amount of material. Each millimeter is probably tens of thousands of miles if it's the right quality pad material. When you apply the new thread locker, obviously make sure it's the right type. If blue came off, replace it with the blue. And the proper torque rating as well. They have different torque ratings. But you don't want so much that it's dripping off of the bolt. You want just enough so that the bolt is coated on the threads that it needs, and that's enough. I like to go ahead and run these down by hand all the way to zero, before I go trying to run in there with a ratchet, or in this case, I just use a torque wrench. We've got it set to about 66 foot-pounds, which is what the spec said, and we're going to go ahead and torque these. And I like to do it in two stages. We run them both down and then go back and double check to make sure that they're not going to turn any additional. I didn't run into any interference or anything like that. So I like to double check as well. And you'll see me do that here. Okay, now for the part that I see a lot of techs mess up, and I'm talking professional guys that know what they're doing. They put too much grease on the ears of these pads. You see, it only requires just a little bit on the contact points, because what you're trying to do is give it just enough lubrication so that the pad can actually move, and it doesn't bind while it's trying to find its seat or its resting position in the caliper assembly. If the pad gets bound up, then what can happen is it can create a squeal noise, even though you've got a nice brand new pad on a brand new rotor. You absolutely don't want that to happen. If you put too much grease, like a lot of these guys do sometimes, the grease can run out into the rotor and then contaminate the pad friction material. And as you can imagine, that is not a scenario you want, and it is actually something that you really, really need to be careful to not let happen. Okay, and this part is the part that I often struggle with, even still to this day. I've installed so many of these, especially working at Volkswagen. But I think Volkswagen puts this on every single brake caliper that they have. I used to be able to get it by hand doing what I'm doing here, but obviously I have lost a step on my technique. But what I found is the best method, you guys will see me do here in a second, and that is hook one side into the caliper in advance, not like what I just did. But I hook one side into the caliper in advance on one side, and then I hook the other side, and then I use something to give me leverage and assist and pry over. In this case, I just use a Phillips head screwdriver. It worked just fine for me here. But I hook both sides, then I take the screwdriver and I go between the bracket and the spring, and I just pry it up and over. Then once you're done prying it over and you get it up on the other side, you just want to make sure you seat both of those hooks into the caliper and just kind of give it a few taps. Make sure it's seated and you're good to go. All right, looks like everything is done. I just double checked that I didn't forget those dust caps, and I removed my special holder tool. Okay, you're going to see me do a final quality control check here that sometimes can help catch an issue. Maybe you made a mistake or something's rubbing. I'm listening for any metal on metal scraping noise that doesn't sound like pad rubbing against the rotor. So what you heard me react to there was something that I didn't catch on video, unfortunately. And that was I identified an issue where the rotor was binding. And when you encounter an issue like that, what you need to ask yourself is, why is the rotor binding? Especially when you're dealing with brakes, because it's potentially true that you might have a caliper piston seal issue or a slider issue. One of the things I noticed was when I relieved the pressure, the binding sort of freed up. And I was paying attention to when I compressed the piston, was there roughness, or does it seem like the sliders themselves are potentially causing the issue? All right, so this is me busting the rotor loose off of the hub. If you're reusing the rotor, do not use the hammer type that I was using there. You'd want to use a brass hammer or a rubber mallet. But brass hammer might be the best way to go, because a rubber mallet might not give you the force necessary. But you'll see that I nicked the rotor there with that hammer. I wanted to pause and talk about this is where I found the issue. If you remember, I talked about the rotor binding when it was rotating. This slider pin and even the other one as well, it seemed like they were pretty dry, but they were also, it had some corrosion issues, some sort of contamination. Maybe they were submerged in water at some point. But either way, it was kind of necessary to use a brass bristle brush and just kind of get all of whatever is dried and caked on that slider off before I reapply the lubricant. It's really good to pay attention to these things so that you have the quality result necessary and ensure the brakes operate as designed. I absolutely love these split beam torque wrenches and the way that you adjust the actual torque setting. All you got to do is turn that dial, and you don't have to reset it every single time you put it away. And then you just flip that protector over so you don't accidentally bump it, and you're good to go. Alright guys, so we are done with our rear brake job, and as you can see, our parking brake maintenance mode, words are hard, is still on. So we're gonna go ahead and shut it off, and that light we should see turn off after we do this procedure. Notice that the key is on, and I'm going to do the same thing I did when I activated it. I'm gonna go ahead and take my foot. We're gonna push the accelerator to the floor and hold. We're going to pull up instead on our parking brake, like that. Obviously, it's going to give us a hard way to go about that. Cycle key off. And then back on. Gave me a little bit of a warning. I applied the parking brake, and then I unapplied the parking brake, and the warning is now off. So, shut it off. We are now good to go. I'm going to double check, make sure that we have function of the parking brake. Put it in drive. Yep, we go nowhere. Hey, Mike here, and I just wanted to thank you for watching. And if you've at all gotten any value out of this video, please like and subscribe. And you can leave a comment and let me know if there's anything you want me to produce for you in the future. It really helps me to continue creating these videos if I see that people like and subscribe and comment on the videos. I really appreciate it. Y'all have a wonderful day, and God bless.